afternoon from the 1011 Now streaming studio. I'm Danielle Shenk. This is Inside the Story with the Flatwater Free Press, a nonprofit news organization in Nebraska that focuses on investigative and feature stories. Joining me now is editor Matthew Hansen. He's stepping in for Sarah Gensler and Alex Richards, the duo that wrote the story that we're talking about today. It's about the Ricketts family's influence on Nebraska politics. So, Matt, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Alrighty, so for our first question here, can you tell us a little bit about the Ricketts family, their wealth, and when they started to get involved in Nebraska politics?
Sure. I mean, I think everybody in Nebraska knows, or most people know, that the Ricketts family. Pete Ricketts' dad, Joe, is the founded the company that became TD Ameritrade. Derived a ton, billions from that company, and for decades now. Has been at least a small player in Nebraska politics, but it got way, way bigger when his eldest son, Pete Ricketts, was interested in running for governor. And what our analysis found is that their political giving stepped up, and then really stepped up again near the end of Governor Ricketts' term.
Yeah, can you kind of talk about how their spending did change during Pete Ricketts' time in office?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what you see with kind of wealthy politicians and their families is that the funding spikes around their own elections, right? It makes sense. You can self-fund an election. You don't have to go raise a lot of money. Actually, in the case of Pete Ricketts and his family, they really have concentrated, especially sort of initially when he was kind of first governor, at spreading the money around in the state of Nebraska. So you see a lot of small donations to kind of lower level politicians, down to county sheriff's race, all the way up to the person who eventually succeeded him, Governor Jim Pillen, who the Ricketts family donated a very large amount of money to.
Right, and so this article has a nifty chart here that we're pulling up. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that and the spending that we're seeing here in this chart, and touching on how, if it was spent in one section or numerous parts of government?
Yeah. I mean, basically what that shows is kind of the overall giving, and then the Ricketts family's share of it. And that both the total amount of money that they were donating and also the share of their part of the total increases over time, kind of culminating in this last election cycle when Governor Pillen was elected. I believe the Ricketts family got to 7% of all political giving in the state of Nebraska. I should be clear, that's everything. Individuals, organizations, companies. So that's a really large percentage of the total when you consider it's all political giving in the state.
Mm-hmm. And so you had reached out to Ricketts for this article, and while he declined an interview, he did send back some written responses. And so did he mention why he wanted to get more involved in politics and kind of his role in that?
Yeah, I mean, he and Jessica Flanagan, who's one of his longtime advisors, who did do an interview with us, talked about sort of why, from their point of view, this money is given, particularly his money. I mean, it's different than his parents' money in his view. His campaign contributions, they say, are tied very specifically to trying to elect the most conservative candidates who can win a given race. So to them, it's a pretty simple calculus. Here are two people running. We support this person more than this other person. Therefore, we're going to give candidate X money. Other people, certainly people who, including Republicans who he's opposed, see it as more of sometimes a personal thing, where they make a decision that he didn't like as governor, a vote that he didn't like, and then suddenly there's somebody running against them, and the governor at that time, Governor Ricketts, is supporting the challenger.
Right, and so as you had said, Pete began funding candidates that aligned more with his views, and this actually impacted a couple of races, including one that you had mentioned in this article. So can you kind of tell us about that example?
Yeah, the story leads with Matt Williams, who's a banker, kind of by look and feel a pretty standard Nebraska Republican through the decades. But one of the things he did when he was elected to the legislature is he took a couple votes. He overrode a couple of the governor's vetoes, and people will remember this. One of them was the repeal of the death penalty, which was then reinstated by a ballot measure. So he took a couple votes like this, and then I should say he had campaigned with Pete Ricketts. They had shared campaign services. Pete Ricketts had given him money, right, for his first campaign. So these were ostensible allies. And then when he runs for regent just a couple years ago, this is many years after he'd opposed Governor Ricketts in a couple of these votes, there's a kind of a pact that's built to attack him in some way, attack his candidacy, and it's entirely funded, or almost entirely funded, by the governor.
Right. And so can you kind of compare the Ricketts family spending in Nebraska to their national contributions?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, I mean, viewed another way, and the family might view it this way, I don't know, but they're not actually spending that much money in Nebraska when you consider the amount of money that they're spending on federal elections. Joe and Marlene Ricketts are some of the biggest donors in the country in federal elections. Sort of a top 15, top 20 donor, depending on the time period and who's calculating it. And the total that Joe and Marlene Ricketts have given federal elections crossed the $100 million mark in the last quarter century or so. So comparatively, in sort of during the time when Pete Ricketts was running for governor and then was governor, about a period of about 10 years total, the total amount the Ricketts family gave was around $10 million. So they could have actually dumped way more money into Nebraska elections. The difference, though, and people I think will understand this, Nebraska is a small state. There's certainly money in the political system here, but it's far different than it is at the federal level, where you literally need billions in some cases to try to win a presidential election. What experts and what other politicians told us was that their money actually has a lot more impact here than it does on a federal level, even though it's a much smaller amount of money.
Yeah, and I mean, kind of just touch on how being wealthy can give you so much different power and sway in things like politics and government.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question because on one hand, the argument is, it is my money. There are no rules in Nebraska around how much I can give, who I can give it to, when, even if I'm the governor, right? So all laws are being followed. And to be quite honest, the Ricketts family, as far as we can tell, has been remarkably transparent in how they've given money inside the state of Nebraska. So I don't want anybody to come away from this thinking that there's some attempt by them to hide the ball here. But it does raise an interesting point about kind of how our state government functions, right? Co-equal branches of government, your high school civics lesson. But if you have a governor who is also one of the biggest funders, and by the way, this happens in states besides Nebraska too, and it happens with Democrats too. But when you have a member of the executive branch who is both sort of trying to convince the legislative branch to pass or not pass bills, and then is also one of the biggest funders to their campaigns, I think people can kind of see the inherent tension between those ideas.
Yeah, and I can't remember if we touched on this when we first started, but how did they kind of get their wealth and get this sway? And it seems like, I mean, they're just have millions and millions that they keep spending on different sectors of the government and elections.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Ricketts was incredibly successful as the founder and the person who grew and ran what became TD Ameritrade has now been merged with Schwab. I mean, we're talking about one of the great American business success stories of the last half century. So he made a lot of money doing that. His family made a lot of money in related investments. I mean, this is a wildly successful American family. They own the Chicago Cubs, for gosh sakes. I mean, they're playing at the very highest levels of the 1% of the 1% of the 1% of the kind of American financial elite. And there's sort of no way around that. I think that makes people sometimes a little bit uncomfortable. But it is the truth, and it starts with TD Ameritrade.
Yeah, and so how did Ricketts' influence and spending as governor kind of set him up for the U.S. Senate seat?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, two things happened. We don't know if they're related or not. Well, I am not suggesting a cause effect, but the Action 1, the Ricketts family, including Pete Ricketts, was one of the biggest donors to kind of Governor Jim Pillen's campaign, and also attacking his primary opponents, particularly Charles Herbster, who, by the way, is the single biggest donor in Nebraska state politics in the last 25 years, bigger even than the Ricketts family. So it's not as if we're talking about Sisters of the Poor on the other side of things. But that they gave a lot of money to Jim Pillen. He was elected governor, and then he appointed Pete Ricketts to the U.S. Senate seat about a week after he was inaugurated. This is after Ben Sasse had stepped down. There's an alternate history here where Pete Ricketts, would be running as a challenger to whoever else would have been appointed, again with a big war chest and also with a lot of popularity inside the state of Nebraska. I mean, he ended his second term as governor, at least in some quarters, as I think it's fair to say, a pretty popular politician. So would the same thing have happened? Maybe. And he's certainly a favorite, or seen as a favorite to win this seat in the remainder of the term in the November election.
Right. And so as we kind of wrap up here, Pete Ricketts' net worth is estimated at about $160 million. That's according to Quiver Quantitative. And so that makes him the fourth richest U.S. senator. How does that impact his giving both federally and locally moving forward, especially during this election season?
Yeah. A national expert told us that it sets up an interesting situation for him where he has a lot of money to spend. His parents have a lot more, but I should say they don't always spend the money in the same ways, right? It's not. We have no proof that they're acting in concert. For example, they would argue that they're not. But there's a lot of wealth there. There's a clear demonstrated ability and desire to fund campaigns, and if he's in a safe Senate seat, which Nebraska is presumed to be for a Republican, what the expert told us is what he can do is funnel a lot of that, his own campaign money or related giving, to other more at-risk Republican U.S. senators, which leads him to more influence inside of the United States Senate. Maybe not the king, but certainly a kingmaker. It certainly can derive you more power inside that institution.
Right. Is there anything else you want to add about this article that the Flatwater has dove into?
Just that I think that it's an important thing. Campaign finance and kind of understanding where the money comes from is a pretty important topic. I think sometimes people get a little, it can be boring, right? But it's something that I'm proud that we looked into it here. We're going to continue to write stories about this. We have a lot of data. We're going to continue to slice and dice it. And there's also on our website a list of the top 20 Nebraska campaign donors in the last quarter century. There's a lot of Democrats on there. There's a lot of names that people will recognize. So I encourage people to go to our website and kind of look at the overall giving in the state of Nebraska.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us, Matt.
Thanks.
Alrighty. And so also on their website is the article, Ricketts' Riches, Wealthy Governor, Billionaire Family Changed Nebraska Elections. That's the article that we've been talking about. You can find it on flatwaterfreepress.org, or it's also available on 1011now.com. For more news and updates, visit our website and follow us on all our social platforms. From our newsroom to wherever you are. See you on the next stream.